large number of images here, as you'll see, that come from a long period of time in different formats. And as you'll see from the structure of it, it's an essay that took 10 years to write, and as an essay is a form of constant revision and reconsideration. Kind of rewriting is built into the fabric of it. And it seems like I wrote this already in a different era. It's an essay I finished about a year ago and last presented as a slideshow at the end of 2019. And so it feels like it already needs to be rewritten based on the last 2 months of our lives. And I haven't figured out how it would be rewritten yet, but I hope we could talk about that later. And so I guess I'm going to present it to you unchanged, because I don't have the answers for that question, and hope you will take this presentation as dark and sad as it may seem, as something of a naive and luxurious return to a simpler time when we could worry about things like images and selfhood, those simple pleasures of worry. But I also think that the core questions here are still relevant and good to return to even now, because I think these questions are going to come back when things get moving again, and they're going to come back with a vengeance. That's what I think. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to my screen. What I like about this performance in this format is you don't have to look at me, which is amazing. This essay is about 35 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for conversation after. And it's called Making Doubles. Reader, beware. This essay has failed. I've been trying to build it for over a decade, but each new edifice of argument inevitably collapses in a contradictory heap of rubble. I have finally come to accept this essay as a wreckage, the articulated ruins of an unfinished architecture. It's what I deserve for asking myself a trick question, for trying to build at a time when all the fault lines seem active. I wanted you to see what I have been feeling, but the ground kept shifting beneath my heart. I can't stop looking at the picture, slightly blurry, forwarded from my sister's phone. My nephew, barely 3 years old, is beaming. Slightly too long bangs brush roughly away from his face, eyes engaging the camera. His left hand grips the larger, cooler hand of a Uniqlo store mannequin in a royal blue t-shirt. My nephew looks ecstatic, as if he has just made a new and lasting friend. But I also think, with a sigh, he is learning. I'm sure that my brother-in-law taking the picture and my sister just out of frame do not see it this way. I'm sure I wouldn't have either were I there with my clever and adorable nephew. I'm sure I would have marveled at his giddy enjoyment of the scene, himself free from the obligation to shop, select, and spend. His sensations and expressions would seem purely his own, my marvelous nephew making his world as he makes sense of ours. For all the delight of the photograph, I cannot escape the chill. A certainty of what he is being shaped into at that very moment. The invisible shadow of relentless economic and cultural systems closing in on him with their sparkly selections, their inanimate stand-ins taking him by the hand. In the picture, we can see the coercion of capital is no joke. It is a web and a spectacle, and he is already entangled. In person, the next time I see him, I learn all about the Batman-themed sneakers he wants, inspired by envy of another child. But hearing him tell it, I am reassured by his presence and spirit. It seems self-evident to me that his individuality will triumph over consumerist conformity. He loves Batman in his own way, I reason. His charming self is pure. But the photograph arriving wirelessly to my remote device had told me otherwise. Why was that? What, I wonder, is the relationship between that delicious, terrible pedagogy we so often forget to call ideology and our appearances and pictures? This question germinated for me in 2007 when I was organizing an exhibition in Moscow about the common psychic and emotional experiences expressed through contemporary art of living in George W. Bush-era America and Putin-era Russia. I had been trying to figure out why artists and people in general had such a hard time responding to the experience of living within the oppressions of coercive belief by saying no. Why was it so easy for us to recognize the condition and then willingly collude? Why was it so difficult to refuse, withdraw, or attempt change? In the process of mulling over this conundrum, by no means a new one, I was suddenly struck by the old specter of Dostoevsky's The Double. As a teenager, I felt that Dostoevsky was all about angst and personal, moral, emotional struggle. But I could not see that his work was also always about the pain of living ideology. And the figure of the double, invented by his pathetic hero's unconscious as a desperate response to psychic pain, suddenly appeared to me as a figure we all share without knowing it. The double of ourselves that must navigate successfully within the logic of socioeconomic forces, so that we can pretend that we have a purer self, one outside the systems of dogma and power that surround and shape us. The tragedy of Dostoevsky's protagonist is that his double, happily navigating the mores and goals of his social circumstance, succeed in all the ways that the original man cannot. His double is efficient and politic at work, effortlessly ambitious in society, a truly successful conformist in a way that the earnest emotional clerk could never be. But purity of self has its cost. The double replaces him and destroys his life. His double annihilates him by successfully navigating the class cues of society, of capital and politics as rendered through social mores, fashion, and notions of production and consumption. As readers, we hate that double for his inauthenticity, for his intentionality, but of course we fear that we are closer to the double than to that poor, hapless clerk. And we don't really want to end up like that loser anyways. In Dostoevsky's novella, the double is clearly accepted as another, not the self, but another self, and the one preferred by authority and society, the favored child of coercive learning. It is not an abstraction or a fantasy. The submitting double supplants the actual stubborn self. But what did this mean to me exactly, and why was I convinced that photographs played a crucial role in this collective and largely unacknowledged psychic split? I did not know, and I was in Moscow, being physically pushed every day on the metro by the sheer force of post-communist, high capitalist frenzy. It was all I could do to remain upright. I put the question aside. Nearly 20 years before my sister sent me that photograph of my nephew, a friend came into work one day with a treasured family snapshot. It was the mid-1990s when photography had finally become art, but nothing meant anything anyway, because history had ended along with television and pop music. She gleefully shared the old photograph around the office and everyone laughed and loved it. My friend, as a child, stood proudly mid-frame, bare legs between short yellow shorts and stark white socks, a pastel striped polo shirt, leading the eye upwards to a white hat with a wide black visor. A look of sun-blasted seriousness compressed her face. 3 smaller girls flanked her, 2 left and 1 right, and interspersed among them a couple of Cabbage Patch dolls. All of them, including the dolls, had their arms stretched out, clasping other hands. It was Hands Across America, that absurdly momentous spectacle of 1986, attempting to forge an unbroken chain of humanity across the full breadth of Reagan's America. I did not trust my own memory, so I immediately wrote my friend, and she had sent me immediately a copy of the image in question. It was almost exactly as I had remembered. There, in the middle of it, was Nikki, holding hands with a Cabbage Patch Kid in Hands Across America. What made this image so hysterical? I think it was the shock of someone you know, an irreducible individual, suddenly flattened into the ideological spectacle of mass culture, as if Nikki was temporarily not Nikki, reduced before my eyes to a link in the chain of Hands Across America, a Cabbage Patch consumer. This transformation of known soul and self into the raw stuff of collectively coerced belief, the social, had to be a laugh riot, because if it wasn't laughable, it was true. This is one true terror of the double, a terror made plain to us in the photograph at the same time as this truth is flattened, contained, bracketed safely away from the ultimate self. But how does this dubious mechanism operate? Are we able to see ourselves as material subjects of power in photographs because we are flattened onto the same plane as any other given thing, chairs, walls, cups, and tabletops, equally present and equally objectified? In life, objects seem to submit to the authority of our animate-willed selves. In the photograph, we are no more autonomous than the mass-produced t-shirt and jeans we are wearing, the store-bought lamp that illuminates us, the can of beer in our hands. It's a way of seeing that we can't perceive from inside our own bodies. The photograph maps our doubles inevitably enmesh status in the world of capital and its junk materials of ideology. To be only an object is a disappointment and a gift. It is a kind of relief and a comfort of belonging to see oneself so clearly subsumed by the general condition of a culture. Are we let off the hook as aspiring individuals when we are reminded of this blind submission, freed from the need to define oneself, to forge an original self, to be distinct? Photographs don't steal your soul, but they might reveal quite bluntly that you are not one. It was early in 2016 when I remembered Nikki's photograph, and already the air was thick with politics. Every hour I read something new to fill me with rage or hope or sadness. There was no room to finish a thought. My next double date was with Joseph Conrad's strange, dark, homoerotic short story, The Secret Sharer. Conrad's narrator, a responsible bourgeois ship's captain, meets and harbors his murderous double, enjoying their intimate seclusion in his private quarters while the law closes in around them. The captain then helps his homicidal duplicate escape into an island paradise, alone, naked, unpunished, while the captain, blameless but gratified, continues on the return journey to civilization. Conrad's narrator discovers the erotic potential of the murderous self, but still submits to the necessity of living within society's bounds by sending that unfettered, powerful, naked self away and continuing on alone. The double transgresses on behalf of the self, but must also disappear. Still, the captain knows that his handsome, violent, uncontrolled double is out there, somewhere beyond the laws. The double gets off scot-free. I want to insist that the self, reproduced in the picture, is also an agent of possibility, like Conrad's murdering double. The photographer Luigi Ghiri writes, "Photography is not mere duplication, nor is the camera simply an optical device that brings the physical world to a halt. Photography is a language in which the difference between reproduction and interpretation, however subtle, exists and gives rise to an infinite number of imaginary worlds. Even the objects that seem to be entirely described by our own seeing, once represented, may turn out to be like the blank pages of a book yet to be written. And this unwritten book can be autobiography, by which I mean fiction. The you in the picture is never you. In becoming that double, it both menaces and protects the self. It creates the space for transgressive or conformist fantasies. Ghiri suggests that in a photograph, we can imagine a blank page where there isn't one. On the one hand, we can see our second self, subject to the cruel generalities of culture, society, economy. This other us is trapped in the picture while we float free. But our duplicate can also be the image, like Conrad's double, that escapes the compromises of the social, because it seems to confirm so intensely the singularity of a given self. Look at that expression, that smile, that set of jaw, that twinkling eye, that awkward or elegant carriage, that silhouette. Look, we tell each other, that image is a quintessence of you. The photograph helps us enact a potentially perverse joy we take in dissolving into the manufactured collectivity of mass culture while making a vain attempt to preserve individuality within that very act of collusion. Watching the Super Bowl, we are all the same in that none of us matters. We are data points of an astonishing statistic of mass submission. In the car, inadvertently tapping our feet to an awful Bruno Mars ditty or a ravishing Beyonce ballad, we are the same. The judgments there are mine, they do not matter. Why do we think that the image of ourselves in the teeth of this mass consumption, which feels so good precisely because it lets us feel part of a giant flood of collectively seduced humanity, somehow singles us out? How do we belong without disappearing? How do we resist without disappearing? Are there two more impossible questions in the world? I realize that I have been ignoring that central question of time, the great dogwag of photography. So I decide to begin again, mindful that time today is not what it once was. The future is always a blind curve in the road, but we don't see it because we are usually looking away. In the photograph, we can recognize that the self is always frozen on the brink of the moment after. Something happens to us seen in photographs, even if those images are only days or weeks old, something that I can only call painful. We see ourselves in a state of frozen ignorance. That floating moment of us is necessarily unaware of everything that we are yet to encounter. It is a smiling, happy, confident blindness, but that momentary spectacle of us also seems to have lost or forgotten everything that came before it, to have offered itself up to a surface without history, born anew in naive confidence, without knowing all the past that was carried in the four-dimensional original. There is nothing more freeing and more vulnerable than knowing neither past nor future. Pure presence is not something we are often able to live, but we can see it here, for better or for worse, when we are pictured. But this last paragraph is already as out of date as an iPhone 4. These days, the present refreshes as fast as we can type. The present of the text that I just received has been replaced by the present in which I am typing my response. And the photograph seems to serve this god of the endless, tedious, anxious present more readily than the old gods of nostalgia or prognostication. We now willingly assign our images a 24-hour shelf life. After that, existence needs to be proven all over again. We offer our present up as a near constant commodity for the use and profit of a distant corporate demigod. This is what I mean by tribute. We are trying to tell each other and ourselves that we're alive and well, that we're happy or sometimes sad, but always whole and present and looking our best. It is a strike against both past and future to treat an image this way. It denudes history and possibility at once, but who has time? We can always stream more history and possibility later when we need it. Is it possible that people take and circulate so many pictures these days, not because they can, but because for existential reasons they have to? Perhaps the more time they spend with their primary attention dedicated to a technological product that is itself a portal into endless forms of free consumption, products, politics, and every kinds of social conditioning, the more they need to reaffirm their individual existence or sacrifice an image of themselves to the indifferent gods of sociocultural submission in the name of their imperiled identities. That is no longer a question of future or past, of hope or memory. It is a constantly refreshing existential crisis. Our skin in an image, from messaging to Tinder to Grindr, is often used as a kind of virtual bait. We dangle a trace of ourselves, deployed to lead our quarry, the objects from whom we desire attention, back to our actual lives. Our image is now a link or tag to our physical manifestation. A link is not a representation, a memory, or an imagining. It is an instrument, an icon, a reminder, a reference. It may also be our last hope, telegraphing our ongoing desire to be touched. Perhaps all of this explains why, when I look at a selfie, I smell fear. Such a banal synesthesia, I know. I can't help but sense this act as an anxiety response, people reassuring themselves that they're still there, reminding others that they exist, that they can still surrender themselves to the camera. I recall someone telling me, you should really post on Instagram at least 3 times a day, lest you fall off the map. I ask myself, writing this essay, why I keep referring absurdly to old gods and new gods when I don't believe in gods. I think it's because I am weak and need metaphors, and a pagan theology makes sense in the world we live in. Our gods of society, politics, and capital place competing demands on the individual and each other. There is a complex economy of ritual, sacrifice, and reward that is none of the clear hierarchical organization of those more ridiculous monotheisms. Nobody suffered in advance for our sins. This system is pay as you go. The gods care not for our souls, but only for their agendas. The god Techne gave us photography, and she expects a reward. Our pictures are our currency. We return them like burnt offerings. Now, as I write, it is one endless week before the 2016 election day. This whole grinding, pervasive, painful, emotional, hopeful, tragic election cycle has drawn on so long and taken so much out of us. I feel myself in pain at the suffering that the ideological in one of its most melodramatic incarnations, has wrought so directly, readably on our lives to so many degrees in so many registers, with such a range of bodily and immaterial consequences. How could we not want something to make us feel free of it? Under this dark fog, I have found myself looking over and over at pictures of myself and others, drawn to the innocence of the figure, not registering their placement within coercive learning. A hopeful gleam ignorantly flashing forth a signal of imagined freedom. Not an escape, but a willing and unaware submission. This gesture lives on in the photograph without consequence, repercussion, blame, or regret. Such photographs promise to lift the burden off me over and over again, and always only for the moment of exchange. In 1859, Oliver Wendell Holmes erroneously predicted the replacement of most touristic travel with the advent of great stereographic libraries in every city. Citizens of all stations would enjoy the three-dimensional illusion produced by a doubled photograph inserted in an optical viewing device and feel themselves transported to Paris, Petra, the Taj Mahal, or an African safari. Holmes asserted that photograph subjects, like big game, surrendered up their skins to be picked up by the film played and carried away for all to see. These skins, spoken in the colonialist argot of the hunting trophy, were ill-defined, but they seemed to be inexhaustible, and every single thing on earth had many skins to spare. It's as if we individuals think that our own skins can be similarly shed in photographic sacrifice over and over again, carrying away our sullied surfaces that are exposed to all manner of social coercion and leaving our pure interior souls intact. The categories of the individual and humanity are brilliantly and cruelly designed to occlude ideological systems. This is obvious. In fact, it is an Althusserian and 1960s Godardian obviousness. But the role of the photograph has not been fully understood in this regard. It is not only a medium of indoctrination, it is a release valve and an illusionary removal system, like silly putty on a newspaper comic. The image of ourselves trapped within markets and social and political coercions is, over and over again, lifted away from us in a photograph, a kind of facial peel, the spiritually imperiled self. Perhaps I've been approaching this wrong, it occurs to me, a week after the election. Now it no longer feels like photographs can carry anything for us. The image of a hideous bigot spouting a seeming incoherency of violent, cruel, petulant, and occasionally sensible assertions has, quote, won power. We are passing over into one of those societies in which the exercise of ideology is unavoidably material, physical, and visible, a manifest violence. Suddenly we have become our aloof doubles, and the reality is not what we had imagined. It hurts and it menaces. The illusion of distance that neoliberalism has allowed seems all of a sudden quaint, as if it had no intention or fault in taking us there. We no longer have use for the suspension of the free self in the ether of the remotely ideological. We are now in the world of video clips, beatings, mobs, speeches, massing fluid shows of force, aerial views of scattering resistance, roundups, lines, threats, deportations. Photography is inadequate to these events. The double and the cushion of plausible difference it sustained feels suddenly, utterly gone. But are we moved to step away from the photograph here, taking up the yoke of the political without need or possibility of release? Mostly, the answer is no. Instead, we double down on images with a will to see ourselves and be seen within the immediately identifiable struggle. Protest march selfies abound, as do panning videos that assert the photographer at the center of a mobilized citizenry. For a moment, we are in it, our images insist, but then we are not. We let the photograph stand before us as a placeholder of our embeddedness, while we slink back to our jobs, our joys, our personal struggles, as if our doubles will carry on the fight for us. I still remember the pride, or perhaps relief, that my parents exuded when they would stop on a photograph of my father, young and beautiful, my older brother on his shoulders, marching against the Vietnam War on the Washington Mall in 1969. My parents have never been activists, but this one image lived as a promissory tableau of their impassioned participation, a proof that they were in the fight, even as they left or never really joined. I do not blame them. They had 4 children. I had a dog, and I have done no better. Sometimes we desperately need to see ourselves within the dastardly machine of coercive belief for reasons of survival, to advance our desires and ideals in the world. or to provide the illusion of power that belonging implies. Photographs can carry that embrace or submission for us. Once at a flea market in Rome, I came across 3 black and white photographs dated 1938. In each image, 2 young men from fascist Italy pose in front of the landmarks of fascist Berlin. The men are perhaps in their early 40s. They are relatively small in the frame, their faces shaded by their fedoras, their bodies lost under long overcoats, and they appear focused in posture, gaze, and set of jaw, the serious place at which tourism and pilgrimage meet. There they stand in naive pride before the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate. Their doubles here testify for posterity to their accord with the terrible splendor of what we now, so casually, too casually, as if it is okay, call nationalism. I had the sensation that if I held the thin print up to the light in the right way, these words would appear. I am white, help me stay that way. More than a year into this terrible government, this mean and messy presidency, I am thinking about the double again. And I find that all the above arguments feel moot. What made me think that a photograph rescued or killed anything? At most, it was a thin piece of paper, now a density of dots on a screen for a moment that is instantly replaced by another. In Dostoevsky's imagining, a world in which the paranoid becomes true, the double annihilates and replaces the original. The irreducible self is gone. Are all these images simply the equivalent of a hospital modesty screen, helping our neighbors not to witness the death throes of our original souls? We all want a politics that leaves room for the self, but that might be too much to ask. To live consciously and aware within ideology, writ large as the social or writ small as politics, is hard because the mechanism is so rigged and it can feel impossible to trace or remedy how we got here. Magic tricks are supposed to be thrilling, but this trick is awful. I want to go back and start over, this time in 1980. Superman 2, starring Christopher Reeve, begins with the trial of Krypton's traitors, who resemble nothing so much as a new wave-inflected European post-punk pop band. For their treachery, the band is banished in a most dramatic way, flattened alive into a 2-dimensional rectangular plane, which flies in to claim them and then spins out again into the void of space. General Zod and his co-conspirators scream in helpless rage, 6 mime hands splayed desperately against the clear surface of their new jail. Of course, our own fate with photographs is less dire than this, as we seem to continue on just fine while our image remains in the flattened plane. Nonetheless, photographs are prisons, trapping us in the moral judgment of the will of law, which is sometimes called the social contract. Photographs lock up the crime, the submission, the collusion, but not the criminal, whom we may also call the victim, the hero, or the bystander. In Philadelphia in the early 1990s, I worked as an in-house photographer for a corrupt and sadistic art dealer. In those days, making doubles was something you did whenever you were getting prints made and might want to share them with friends or family, or send images of overpriced inventory to unsuspecting clients. Making doubles was a minor investment in the pre-digital image sharing economy. And since the printing was on my boss's account, I made doubles of everything as a kind of tax on my employee suffering. Thousands of doubles that piled up untouched. This whole episode of my life still lives in duplicate in boxes in an unfinished attic in upstate New York. Today, the concept of doubles or any multiple of images is nearly moot. The image is both singular, a specific file with a specific arrangement of pixels, and infinite. It is no longer reproduced. When you upload an image, it also stays where it was. When you download an image, it does not seem to notice. Perhaps within that new ontology of photographs, always there and always singular, it is now easier to believe that you are singularly represented by an image that nonetheless proliferates, is available almost anywhere. There are no longer any copies. In some senses, this is a mercy. I recently unearthed a stack of these doubles that I had made in the art gallery. In each photograph, the object, an antique map, rare book, or decorative print, was duly displayed against black fabric and evenly lit. But approaching clumsily from the side, with an unfortunate early 1990s goatee or round silver spectacles, was me, staring straight at the lens, as if I also expected to be a rare commodity. The objects kept changing, but my dress and place and gaze did not alter. I cannot even remotely recall the impulse that made me take these pictures, but the effect of this doubled me, asserting over and over again some unknown argument for my own presence, identically, twice, was almost unbearable to look at. The value and rarity of the objects that accompanied me may have been exaggerated or overestimated, but this double me was certainly false. Not even a man. Two tediously identical reproductions, each obliterating the authenticity of the other. Photographs have a way of humiliating the original. Why does it seem so hard to be ourselves in ideology? Or to put it another way, where did we get the idea that our true selves are more than the sum of our movement through the indoctrinations of the social? Of course, it is society that's applied the idea of our individual authenticities in the first place. Even recognizing that, it is a hard idea to give up on. Ask Walter Benjamin, that committed Marxist. He could never get over himself. To most people, I must assume, the self on the screen feels continuous with their daily lived self. It may even serve to affirm to them their authenticity. Maybe these pictures say, just me being me. Your friend posts a selfie. She is red-faced with triumphant exertion, standing atop a mountain with a scenic vista behind her. She is smiling vigorously and flashing the peace sign with her free hand. You might look at the image and know her well enough to understand that she does not subscribe to the banal intellectual collapse that peace sign layered over beautiful nature implies. She is not a peddler of this contemptible hippie solecism, equating naive pacifism with a love of the great outdoors, most useful to the political right as a means to dismiss serious ecological concern. She is well informed on global warming, she is conscientious, environmentally aware, and she votes, but there she is. And you forgive her automatically. You laugh, you might have done the same. Because in this overwhelming world, flattening of the complexity of ideas, of your body against vast nature, of your faraway friend into the near space of your heart is such a relief. Thank God we have these doubles to do it for us. Your friend might also instinctively already understand that posting a picture is akin to asking a question of a strange magic 8-ball, where the answer, algorithmically conjured, always comes back as one word: submit. Contextualized as these images are within the indexing and identity crafting structures of social media, there is no outside of conformity. We're either conforming forthrightly to one idea of self or conforming to nonconformity. In this space, they are the same thing. Sabrina Harmon, one of the young soldier photographers at Abu Ghraib, posed before dead and tortured bodies with a broad smile and an enthusiastic thumbs up. She claimed to have taken the pictures to document what she knew to be criminal, but the world countered, "You look so happy." I think she understood more about the double than the rest of us. She knew on some level that she was serving up as sacrifice an image of herself, enacting collusion with the violence of power in the readable tableau of the flat photograph to show us that something was wrong. She sent her double agent into the world to shock us into shame. Perhaps we unconsciously offer up our inauthentic selves, flattened into caricatures of social submission, to secretly inform the future that these doubles are not really us. A coded message transmitted by us hostages. Something is terribly wrong. Ever since the 2016 election, I've wanted to photograph the world, and especially individuals, only as refracted in mirrors. The mirror is not a photograph, a reflection is not a double, and you can see that in these pictures. In the glass, we encounter our image on equal footing. We arrive and depart together. We continue to breathe and blink in synchrony. My reflection and I are coextensive, and we seem to see each other. The reflection is ourself. The photo is a double. When I go out, the mirror returns to being a picture of an empty room. I wonder if Jewish custom shrouds mirrors during mourning so we are not reminded too vigorously that our own lives continue. Mirrors restore me to my ongoing present. These days, mirrors make me feel a little better. Some days, by the time I tap out of the album on my phone, I feel like I've just visited a prison of my exiled selves, floating in a limbo of still pending judgments. Was I happy? Was I wise? Was I honest? Could I have been better? I wish I could tell them all what I know now about the minutes, days, and years around the curve in front of them, to lighten the load or help them bear it better. I close the album and continue with my day while they hang there flattened in weightless space, like so many Superman villains plotting their revenge. Thank you.
Can you there you go.
Yeah, I had to go out of the full screen.
Thank you so much, people. That was great.
Thank you, Nick.
As people, if you want to ask questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. There's a little sign on the participants thing that allows you to raise your hand. I'll keep scrolling and look for little green hands that appear, and I will unmute you. So let's begin the conversation. There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's not a tidy argument. It's an unfolding series of reactions and, like I said, revisions.
The thing that strikes me, and the thing that I think people are battling with right now, Nicholas, is the feeling of inadequacy, the feeling of impotence in this space of being, confined to be at home, and and I just can't help but think about how much your writing and your pretty much your work in your life has resonated with that, not wanting to do so much, but just not being able to break through that. I don't know if you have any more to say on that.
Yes, I admit that my entire career is based on the study of my own inadequacy. I'll try not to think too hard about what that says about me, but I think feeling things are inadequate is the flip side of wanting a lot out of something. In my defense, and I think that I've been, as I said at the beginning, I've been trying to think about what the subject of this essay means now or can mean now, and I think it's like a different kind of inadequacy than we were prepared for in terms of what photography can do. And it has to do with if we're talking about our idea of self and the social as defined through media forms, broadly speaking, we suddenly entered an experience where the media forms that had been presented to us didn't prepare us to construct ourselves in this context. Is sort of how I think about it. Our training was about narcissism and self-loathing in some tumultuous thing, and suddenly it's about this suspension of all kinds of things and possibilities, a suspension of time as a forward-moving trajectory, or the illusion of that. I don't think that's really what happened, but that's what it feels like. And those are things that are hard to represent, I think, to ourselves because we don't have a visual language for them in certain ways, and they're so largely invisible too. I mean, a lot of things are invisible, but the current circumstance, except for this image, I think about the paucity of images of the present and what you see repeated over and over again. Screen grabs, that's a representation of the present. That and people with masks. One thing I was sort of fascinated by in the early days of a lot of news coverage of the virus spreading in the US was photographs overwhelmingly showed people with masks on at a time when almost no one was wearing masks, because masks were the only thing they could think to show you. It was like a radical misrepresentation, but it was what do we got that's visible that says this thing? Oh, I got some mask. And I think that's kind of a striking thing to think about. How do we develop a visual or media vocabulary to talk about this? And I feel that myself as an image maker, and I feel like a lot of image makers I know feel that as well.
Jason has got a question, but if you don't mind, I want to just say one thing about that. I do think that collectively, I think there's power in the collective imagery and collective voices. There's lots of, I think the collective is an answer to that, but I'm not going to say any more. Jason, do you have a question?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse me. Thank you so much for this event. And Nicholas, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was really struck by something you just said about how it doesn't take the form of an argument, which I really appreciate that it doesn't take the form of an argument. I'm so glad that it doesn't. I think sometimes the form of an argument can strangle out all of the different like emotional valences, like diversions, diversionary tactics, all of these things that you do that make your work and this text and this performance just so rich. So maybe to make it a little more specific, you talked about disappearance in a bunch of different ways, like disappearing into the image, disappearing into ourselves, disappearing into capital. And also, like, I think to me, what really caught my attention was disappearing into sociality. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about disappearance and maybe even disappearing acts. Thank you.
Wow. That's a better question than I'm prepared to answer. Disappearance. I mean, I think disappearance is one of those things that we have like varying impulses towards. Like disappearing is something that in certain ways can be like an escape, but so often, and I think especially in a culture that is focused on like the visible self or presenting self, disappearance is like a threat. Like appearing is sort of a commodity of self, and that's the economy so often. And not being visible is a threat, but also putting yourself into the surface of all these images, there's a disappearance of individual selfhood and self-experience, and a disappearance of like the continuity of time and experience as well, I guess. I think a lot about disappearance in relationship to photography, because photography is allegedly so much about appearances, the appearance of something, even though it's also so much about like the removal of things, what's not there in terms of like voice or time or relationship or like connection. So I would love to learn what's a disappearing act. Except like turning my video off right now. But that's not really a lame act. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I answered that question very well, really. Maybe someone else wants to follow up with what they think about disappearing acts. Or we can talk about something else.
So I'm a documentary photographer. And, you know, your writings have put up a few, more than a few things to really reckon with so far. And it's something that I think we all think about, and it's about the thresholds that, I mean, the limitations of each photograph, how they can seem to do something, but they can't. I'm also an activist, and so they can do one thing, they can represent, they can tell a story, possibly they can suggest a narrative, but they can't actually solicit the change that I'm really thinking about when I'm making the work I make. And I feel like, yeah, I want to. I don't know how else to like explore this form, because anyway, so I just feel like you've sent me a lot of ways to keep thinking and a lot of roadblocks. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
I mean, I think I feel like the quote that I say, by a writer that I say the most when I'm thinking about photography and what I want from it is a quote that I like because it can apply in any context of what the photograph's like usefulness is to me, which is something Willem Flusser said in Towards a Philosophy of Photography, where he says he defines photography, he defines the photographer as someone who makes images outside of the camera's program. In other words, that defy what the photograph as a mechanism is designed to do in some sense, and as like a cultural and social and political and scientific mechanism, like outside of what it's supposed to do. But they turn it in such a way that it exposes, I mean, this is my reading of it, he doesn't fully explain that beyond what I just said, really. That exposes another angle of seeing beyond the way we're expected to read the image. And that's why I think, like, the reason I talk about inadequacy or failure so much is not because I'm a pessimist, but because, like, talking about those things exposes the way in which images leave out other information and hopefully give you ways to bring in other information or other ways of seeing that are, that connect. And maybe this is like the thing that I come back to the most, connect individual experience to political and social experience. And I think maybe that's, when I say that out loud, that might be a problem of what we're going through in the present, is like, what is personal experience versus social experience versus political experience right now? Because this one thing has sort of like put a blanket over all of those distinctions. I'm just speculating out loud. Like that one fear has overridden all those distinctions or something at the moment.
I'm going to read you a comment that Judy Heller wrote in the chat box. She says, "Thank you so much for your courageous articulation of such challenging concepts that have such resonance now. I'm going to have to watch this again, as your presentation was an invitation to self-examine who we are, who we were, who we are becoming, both societally and individually." I just thought that was something to say out loud. Thank you, Judy. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? I think you can unmute yourself. That was by Judy Heller. She's part of our conversation tonight.
I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's totally awesome to see you, and thank you, Nicholas, for your insightful words and this wonderful program. And I love you all. It's so good to see you all during this time.
Thank you very much. Thanks for setting it up, and thank you all for hanging out through this whole conversation.
Again, I want to promote your book. You know, this book has got more than this essay. This is the opening essay, but it's a series of essays and images. And I hope people will go and buy Lacuna Park. And I think Mark is on the call as well, if Mark wants to say anything. Another person wrote, "I'm thinking a lot about the idea of a photograph as a prison. And it makes me think about the idea some people from my country view photography due to the paranoia from the communist era. So I ask myself often, what is our responsibility to our subjects and their past future representation?" That is from Iba Zajmi. Oh, Gergi, I'm so sorry. If you want to, I'm really sorry that I can't pronounce your name as well as I should be able to. But the idea of the photograph as a prison. But I also am curious about your connection to the Soviet Union. And it seems like you spend a lot of time with artists there and thinking about the connections.
Yeah, that's sort of a long story. That's partly just accident. In my biography, I guess, that I studied Russian language and literature and then spent time in Russia when the Soviet Union was collapsing, and fascinated by the sort of hungry mess of that time and that place, and also how wonderful and interesting people were. So I've continued to go back there. I sometimes think it's like a weird, distorted mirror image of this country And so that's sort of a fascination of mine, is how that happens, how these countries that are built on sort of like conceptual ideas rather than like original ethnic boundaries, let's say, and ideas of empire reflect each other in weird ways and like mirror each other in weird ways, and like the way that the ongoing like discord but also fascination between those two countries exists. I mean, I'm obviously like a product of the Cold War, so there's that too, but yeah, it's definitely a thing I come back to.
There's another question from Emma R.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to speak, so I'm going to read their questions. What parts of the essay project now feel like they need revision to you, Nicholas, especially in 2020?
Yeah, I guess there's two things that come to mind. One is like a part of, is a revision that I somehow think like I'm inadequate to write, and I would want to like somehow pursue it as a collaboration, which is how, especially but not only in the United States, or particularly but not only in the United States, how the experience of race and how being particularly non-white changes some of the calculus of these questions and some of the calculus of visibility and invisibility and being subsumed in something and disappearing in something. Like I feel all those questions are a little different from that perspective due to like historical, cultural, and racial assumptions, histories, etc. And so like that as a sort of a dialogue is something that I feel like I would like to build out from in this piece. And then just the past couple of months make me think about, I don't know what to think really about how the present has changed some of these questions, but I want to start thinking about it. And it makes me think about like how much our ideas of visuality, we think of them as stable and we operate within their vocabulary, but they're really formed by maybe a relatively static set of like social and cultural and economic circumstances, and they can become inadequate really suddenly. Like as soon as something happens big enough that shifts that experience, then we're sort of at sea all over again. So I don't really know the answer to that, because I haven't had time to like think through it, I think, because none of us have. So I'm interested in that, exploring that reality. Maybe I'll need a little bit of time to have some perspective on it. Though I'm also curious to see what things return to when, you know, normalcy returns to this world, and the ways in which these questions come back. And I feel like they'll come back, like I said at the beginning. So I don't know if they'll come back in more forms or not, or just come right back. But that's a question to me too. I feel like our vocabularies will be changed in some way. So those are the things I think about in terms of this essay. Even though I can't keep rewriting it, because it'll like make me insane if I keep writing. I'll keep rewriting it until I die if I do that. So I may not do that, but I want to.
I have one more question from Melissa. She asks, what do you mean by irreducible self?
Thank you, Melissa, for that question. I'm glad you put irreducible self in quotes, because that's how I would put it. I don't think irreducible self exists, but I think it's a feeling that we have. Like we can't help but feel and think from the position of what we assume to be an irreducible self. And I think when we look at images of ourselves or people who are close to us, we either decide it fails to reproduce that self, or we will ourselves to see that self in this image, neither of which are true, I think. And so irreducible self is like a boogeyman or something. It's like a straw man that we keep setting up or something like that. And I think it's like this thing we can't let go of, regardless of how much we see ourselves shaped by so many other forces all the time, like across every region of our lives. We somehow think there's just like us, which, you know, I'm not going to say there isn't us. There isn't a self, obviously, because it would be miserable to be a human without having that sense at all. That's probably like somewhere in the DSM, what it means to not have the illusion, not having the illusion that you have an irreducible self is probably a mental illness in our society, but it might also be real.
I want to, there's one more question, but I think it's very, very long. If you don't mind, I'll ask the last question. Emma asks, if you feel like predicting, what are the ways in which the world won't be returning to normal in relation to photography or otherwise?
Oh, yeah, I don't feel adequate to predicting that, really. I mean, one of the things I think about in the present is like what I hope to be changed by this experience and what I think will actually be changed by this experience about humans.
I don't know if there's any way to predict that. The world is so unknown right now.
It's I think it's early to predict that. You know, there's always this hope that like we're going to learn something as humans, as a society, about like how we take care of each other, or how we protect each other, how we work together. And I don't know how that translates into how images function in society yet, except maybe they function in a more like private way. I would like them to function in a more private and intimate way rather than a public and like discursively flattening way about identity. But I don't feel confident that's what's going to happen. I just don't feel that, because I also think, well, there's going to be lots of media consolidation, and it'll just be like the vocabulary for the image will get even more terrifying or something. I don't know. I'm trying to be positive.
Well, I thank everybody for joining us tonight. This was a really incredible conversation. I really thank you, Nicholas, for doing this and for sharing. And I wanted to welcome you back next Thursday. Photographer Pete Penn will be presenting his work. Pete was a artist in residence last year at the Philadelphia Photo Art Center, and we'll be excited to hear about presenting his work after on a project that he's been working on for 10 years. So another long, thoughtful project is coming to the fore.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Nick. Such a fantastic conversation.
Thank you both. Thanks,
everyone. Stay positive and stay safe. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you. Good night.
Love to you all.